Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us. We've got large paperwork in front of us today. But with that said, we are delighted to begin today's hearing with something that I consider to be very, very important. We're going to have H.R. 5698, the Protect and Serve Act of 2018. That's 2372, the VA Mission Act of 2018, and H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act of 2018. Obviously, this has drawn full house, and I'm delighted that each of you are here. Violent attacks against our police officers have spiked over the last 10 years. On July 7, 2016, a man ambushed and fired upon a group of police officers in my home in Dallas, Texas, killing 5 brave officers and injuring 9 others. The shooting was the deadliest incident for U.S. law enforcement since the 9/11 attacks. H.R. 5698 allows for the federal prosecution of those who knowingly cause or attempt to cause significant bodily harm to any law enforcement officer. I believe we must ensure that there are steep consequences for anyone who targets law enforcement officers, and we've got to deter these attacks with a strong message that we, the community, the law, will not tolerate this without severe consequences. Second bill under consideration, S-2372, consolidates the VA's multiple community case programs, provides further funding for Choice Program, and establishes an asset and infrastructure review process to recommend actions to modernize and realign the VA's massive medical infrastructure. The final bill before us today, H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act of 2018. This bill addresses the economic challenges facing farmers and ranchers while making historic investments in opportunities for recipients of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as food stamps. There will be more to speak about, and I'm sure every single member will have an opinion on this issue, and we do care about them. This will be on the 3rd panel. So without objection, I'd like to welcome the distinguished gentleman from Florida, the gentleman, Congressman Rutherford, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, to our first panel. However, before we get to you, we're going to defer to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts. But before we get there, I'd like to note for all of our participants today in the hearing that anything that you brought in writing without objection will be inserted into the record, and we look forward to your testimony. Perhaps most of all, it will allow our awesome stenographer the opportunity to carefully complete the record with the proper verbiage and words to where we can make sure it's correct. And I appreciate our awesome stenographer in that effort, as she always does, to make sure that we have conformed properly. Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this committee will consider a number of bills today that run from bipartisan to extremely partisan. In the case of the Farm Bill, I would say it's downright cruel. But let me start first with the bipartisan measure before us, H.R. 5698, the Protect and Serve Act. Each of us recognizes the immense sacrifice and danger that our law enforcement officials face every time they put on their uniforms, and we thank them for protecting our communities. Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida is a former police chief, and she is an original co-sponsor of this bill. It would increase existing penalties in all 50 states for violent crimes against members of law enforcement. There's virtually no disagreement here. The legislation probably could have passed easily under suspension, and since the majority did not put out a call for amendments, I'm confused as to why we are considering this here in the Rules Committee, but nonetheless, I'm happy to welcome Ms. Jackson Lee and Mr. Rutherford, and thank you for your support on this. The second measure is H.R. 5674, the Mission Act. This started off in the Veterans Committee as a bipartisan effort, and the bill does have strong support from many veteran service organizations. But there are some concerns about whether there's the funding necessary to accomplish these policy changes. We should not subject the VA to an unfunded mandate. There are also questions about whether this could put the VA on the path toward privatization and the closure of VA health centers across the country. Ranking Member Walz submitted an amendment to address these concerns, and I'm Disappointed it was rejected in committee along party lines, but it's certainly worthy of debate on the House floor. And that brings us to the third measure we're considering, the Farm Bill. This is a bill that is simply mean-spirited and hurts the most vulnerable among us. It cuts SNAP benefits by $23 billion. If this bill becomes law, millions of people will lose food assistance. Some will see these benefits, these benefits reduced. Others will be kicked off assistance altogether. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimated that 265,000 kids across the country would lose access to free school meals. Again, 265,000 children. You know, when I was growing up, it was school bullies that went after kids' lunch money. It wasn't the United States Congress. So this is shameful. And why are we making these cuts? It baffles me. And maybe it's so that the majority can force their latest unproven and vastly underfunded state-based workforce bureaucracy experiment on the entire nation. There's a lot here to be outraged about, and I'll have more to say that when we question our witnesses. But it's proof of what I've always said. A bad process leads to a bad product. The process here with regard to the Farm Bill was the worst that I have ever seen from the Agriculture Committee, which is traditionally one of the most, if not the most, bipartisan committees in the House. And if you want to know how the process failed, I would urge you to read the draft Farm Bill. It not only diminishes the Agriculture Committee, I think it diminishes this entire House. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman very much. The opportunity for us to respond to this will be available to not only myself but other members. I appreciate the ranking member professionally bringing forth his ideas for debate. There will be professional content and the ability to answer those questions and make sure the committee has a chance to vet them. Mr. Rutherford, we're delighted that you're here. You have served this great nation in law enforcement. You are concerned. I have watched the concern on your face. You came to Congress knowing you were taking another sheriff's place. You have distinguished yourself not only with exemplary ideas about how to protect our law enforcement officers, but have stood with several other members strongly to denounce the attacks on police officers. We're delighted that you're before the Rules Committee. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind words, and thank you, Ranking Member and members of the committee, for this opportunity to appear today to talk about H.R. 5698, the Protect and Serve Act. This legislation is an important step in recognizing the sacrifices of our brave men and women in law enforcement and acknowledging that they increasingly are the targets of heinous ambush-style attacks. The Protect and Serve Act allows federal prosecution of those who knowingly assault law enforcement officers and cause serious bodily harm or attempt to do so. This bill applies to federal law enforcement officers and to state and local officers where there is a nexus of interstate commerce. A prosecution under this new statute may only be pursued if the Attorney General certifies that 1, the state does not have jurisdiction, or 2, the state has requested that the federal government assume jurisdiction, 3, the verdict or sentence obtained pursuant to state charges has left demonstratively unvindicated the federal interest in protecting public safety, or 4, a prosecution by the United States is in the public interest and necessary to secure substantial justice. As the chairman mentioned, on July 7, 2016, Micah Xavier Johnson ambushed and fired upon a group of police officers in Dallas, Texas, killing 5 officers and injuring 9 others. 2 civilian folks were also wounded. Johnson was an Army Reserve Afghan War veteran who was repeatedly angry over police shootings of black men and stated that he wanted to kill white people, especially white police officers. The shooting happened at the end of a protest against the police killings of Alton Sterling in Louisiana and Philando Castile in Minnesota, which had occurred in the preceding days. The Dallas shooting, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, was the deadliest incident for law enforcement since the 9/11 attacks. Only a few weeks ago, on April 19, 2018, 2 Florida sheriff's deputies were ambushed and gunned down while eating at a Chinese restaurant. These types of ambushes not only strike fear into our law enforcement officers, who already put their lives on the line each day, but they also further undermine police-community relations. And we are facing a crisis in policing where unfortunate incidents involving police use of force has for some generated anti-police sentiment and led to an increase in ambush-style attacks. Let me be clear, this bill is not meant to be a retort to those who seek justice for police use of excessive force. I'm told the Judiciary Committee is actively exploring ways to address that issue. A divisive mindset and divisive rhetoric of citizens versus police, pitting these groups against each other helps no one. This bill has a simple yet noble goal, namely to ensure that justice is served when officers are directly attacked simply because they are police officers. These attacks are purposeful attempts to undermine the state and bring down our communities. They not only harm these brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day, they also fundamentally damage our communities. And I want to thank you again for allowing me to be here to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
John, thank you very much. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with my colleague and to thank him for his service as a law enforcement officer before coming to the United States Congress. I think all of us have had experiences that we want to acknowledge and appreciate for officers who have come either to our assistance, the assistance of our neighborhood and community, or our constituents. And so this week in particular, I'm delighted to be able to thank them for their service. There's no argument regarding the difficulty and danger and stress associated with being a police officer. A white paper commissioned by the Rudderman Family Foundation reported that in 2017, 129 police officers died in the line of duty, 46 from shootings, with an additional 140 reported officer suicides. Since the start of 2018, at least 36 law enforcement officers across the U.S. have died while on duty, with 24 of the deaths caused by gunfire. Our hearts go out to the families of those officers who've lost their lives in the line of duty. We just left the floor, Mr. Chairman, and debated H.Res. 285, that is expressing the sense of the House that Congress and the President should empower the creation of police community alliances. Always danger is diminished when we can improve those alliances and that all of us are looking out for each other. As a result of the risks inherent to policing, there is no profession more widely protected as well under federal and state law than working law enforcement. All 50 states have laws in place that enhance penalties for crimes against peace officers and in some instances crimes against the broadly defined category of first responders. I too am reminded of the heinous tragedy in Dallas, loss of officers, and of course in Baton Rouge, among others. And our heart goes out to those departments and those families, and we stand united with them. But for example, my state of Texas has 4 separate criminal statutes addressing attacks on law enforcement officers. And of course, federal laws already impose a life sentence or even the death penalty on persons convicted of killing state and local law enforcement officers. I think there's no doubt that we would want to, through this legislation, further enhance that protection, but I think it's important that we also discuss some concerns. The Protect and Serve Act would create a new offense under Title 18 for the crime of targeting law enforcement officers and result in up to life imprisonment for acts involving kidnapping, rape, or death. I think it's important to note, and I thank the authors, that this is not a mandatory minimum, but it gives the court the opportunity to address this heinous act and to deal with it at the level of the facts that are presented in the court. The bill then reinforces the large number of already existing criminal statutes. The presence of a certification requirement, Section 2, stands as a clear acknowledgement that states carry primary jurisdiction for attacks on state and local police officers. My colleague indicated that this would be activated outside of the enforcement of states, and their jurisdiction would be first in determining how these cases should be treated. So the issue is whether or not this bill adds to the protection of our officers, and I'd like to think that we want to make sure that it does. I would have liked to have seen hearings on this legislation, but as well, I would like to express my concern that this legislation works properly and provides the safety and security of our officers. I want to be clear about the respect that we have for difficult work undertaken by our law enforcement professionals. Though the recent attacks on law enforcement officials create troubling perception of lawlessness, the existing legal framework for prosecuting those cases is adequate at both the state and federal level. But I am not opposed to this legislation. I am, in fact, a supporter of it. But I do think we should raise concerns as it relates to the kinds of additional laws that we have. However, we must also acknowledge the danger in taking such an approach to police practices. And I'd like to offer the fact that we would come here in some weeks to come with the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which will add to the training of our law enforcement officers, training for de-escalation, funding for accreditation for the 18,000 offices that we have across the nation. And as well, I hope that the Judiciary Committee will ultimately present a report in our 2 years of work on the Police Strategies Working Group, where we've attended and visited cities across the nation and talked to police officers about what would work most. None of us want to see a violent act against the men and women who wear the blue unselfishly. But I think it is important to make sure that we have laws that work and match, and let's hope that this legislation will in fact be that kind of initiative, that it will not provide redundancy, it will also provide justice and safety and security for our officers. With that, I want to acknowledge the concerns expressed by a number of advocates, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place this in the record. I yield my time and reserve my time for questions. Thank you so very much.
Without objection, any of the material that either of you brought that was in writing would be entered in the record. Thank you very much. Ms. Rutherford, what Ms. Jackson-Lee says perhaps could be common sense, very common sense ideas. I cannot tell you the circumstances under which a city, a state, a local jurisdiction may not have the ability or may not have the desire necessarily because of any number of circumstances. For instance, as we've seen them in Ferguson, Missouri, as we've seen them in Baltimore, Maryland, some other places, whereby a trial of that nature might be of difficulty to the community. And I'm not trying to suggest anything here that things would be pushed off to someone else, but I see the wisdom of what you're doing. And I think that Ms. Jackson-Lee is asking good questions and questions that would want to be reviewed by any prosecutor in the event of a circumstance where a differing view might become apparent. And I think leaving that in the hands of local community with the option to use the federal government assets and resources would be well within the manner. I believe that we have to understand that there's some viewpoint that people have in the United States today, that there's some justification based upon how they view the world or upon look at the world of law enforcement. And I think it's repugnant to anyone who would not recognize that no one is perfect and that law enforcement has admittedly made mistakes and they try their best to do their training. But to simply take matters into your own hands with gangland-style killing a police officer simply because they wear a badge, not with respect to necessarily anything that they had done, is wrong and should be stopped. So I'm proud of what you've done, full support of it, and I want to thank the gentleman for taking time to be here today. Yes, sir. Did you want to comment on that?
If I could
have
just
gotten something wrong.
Pardon me?
I could have gotten something wrong, so please set me straight.
No, I think you were absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. But what I did want to state publicly with Ms. Jackson Lee here as well, because we had a discussion in committee, in the Judiciary Committee, about the Integrity Act. And I made a commitment to her then that I really want to go forward with that. I can tell you, as a law enforcement professional for 41 years, I'm dedicated to seeing that we have good, professional law enforcement all across this country. And I was so concerned about it at home, and this is what I really want to bring up, because she touched on something that I think is incredibly important. The accreditation process is a very onerous process for law enforcement agencies. I was very proud that the agency that I represented, we actually had earned the triple crown of accreditation. We were accredited by the Commission on Law Enforcement. We were also commissioned on the NCCHC, the National Commission on Corrections Healthcare, and the ACA, the American Corrections Association. All three of those accreditations within my community let my community know that we were committed to excellence, and that we were willing to go through this very onerous and very costly, quite frankly, process to show that we were striving to be the best that we could be, and to have those relationships within our community. As you know, community relations is a big part of the accreditation process. Several goals and objectives are outlined there. So I just wanted to say I'm dedicated to that, and I look forward to working with Ms. Jackson Lee moving forward on that.
I admire you for that, because we have to work together and see this as an issue, because we have African-American law enforcement officers. We have other people who are dedicated, and if you start taking it out on an attack against law enforcement, that's the essence of community in our own neighborhoods, and we just cannot allow this. So thank you very much. Dr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any specific questions. Thank you for bringing this to us on what is Police Recognition Week, and I think it's appropriate to consider it. That evening of July 7th, 2016, not quite 2 years ago, you know, you're kind of wrapping up your workday in your office and listening to the last of the cable talk shows wind down, and this story breaks. And then for the next several hours, you go through streets that Chairman and I know very well in the city of Dallas. Fox News Studio was basically on one of those streets, and they broadcast live the events as they transpired. Chief Brown was good enough to meet with the chairman and members of the delegation afterwards, when clearly he did not have the time or the energy to be meeting with members of Congress. He did, because he thought it was so important that we be included in the processes that they were going through. So your discussion here today brought all that back. I mean, it can happen literally any evening. We turn on our TVs and see the same sort of events unfold. And here were 7 policemen who were there helping protesters protest peacefully, and then became targets themselves. I can't thank you enough for bringing this forward. We need to honor the lives of those officers and all the officers who've died in the line of duty protecting us. We don't thank them enough, and clearly we need to do more. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition. I'll yield back. I have no specific questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add to the gentleman, you did not rekindle my views, my thoughts. I was well aware of them, but as a result of that important meeting that the gentleman attended, the police chief, David Brown, who became a national symbol of effective, strong, willful law enforcement who would not cave under the attack to their families, to their officers, to the community, did ask for our help. And he came to us directly, Dr. Burgess remembers, asked 2 things in particular. We produced one of them within a week, the funding for that, and then as we got into further appropriations, we took care of the other. But active shooting, training for active shooting was not necessarily available. And second, military-style Kevlar equipment to be available to law enforcement was very important. And we we're listening. We're listening, and I think doing the right thing. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I just want to thank both of you for being here, for your testimony, for your service on the committee, and I look forward to supporting the bill, and I have no questions. I yield back.
Thank you very much, gentleman. You're next time. Judge Hastings.
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses. And I join those who praise the law enforcement officers in our communities and across the country who put their uniforms on every day and say goodbye to their loved ones and head out into an uncertain and increasingly violent world in order to protect their fellow citizens. A more admirable profession done right is difficult to fathom. There is no doubt that these officers deserve our praise and support, and I'm, however, unconvinced that this bill does something else that I believe should be done. Today's bill does nothing to address our country's addiction to weapons. If there's anybody in this room that doesn't believe we have a gun epidemic in this country, then I would be extremely surprised. It does nothing to get the guns that are being used to attack our law enforcement officers off the street, and at best, that strikes me as odd. We could be doing something about bump stocks. We could be doing something about assault weapons in many communities where particularly gang violence is rife. A lot of those communities, the police officers are outgunned by the people in the streets. And somehow or another, that doesn't make sense to me that we continue along the lines. What we're doing today and what Sheriff Rutherford and Ms. Jackson Lee are doing is important. But so would be taking up measures that would address gun violence in our society, be it from the mental health perspective or restriction of weapons. I believe that the International Police Chiefs Association supports banning assault weapons. 81% of the people in this country do. And somehow or another, in this institution, although there are 26 reasonable gun measures that are filed by various members of Congress, very little has come to the floor of the House. I find that troubling and will continue to raise that issue until such time as this House of Representatives and this Congress does something to address the gun violence in our society. My colleague Debbie Wasserman Schultz and I have been doing something else that I'm sure the Sheriff and Ms. Jackson Lee would agree. We convened over 2 years ago a police community guidance efforts where we meet regularly with the various police departments and others in our community to lessen the tensions that exist between police and our respective communities. But in any event, I thank you all for bringing this measure, and I look forward to the day that we will be discussing some of the restrictions on weapons that are used to kill police officers that we could be about the business of trying to do something about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Judge Hastings, thank you very much. Gentleman yields back to time. Gentlemen, any other members seek time on the Republican side? Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of our members here for presenting on this very important piece of legislation. I want to speak from two perspectives. As a former 911 dispatcher and having spent 17 and a half years answering 911 calls from the public in Los Angeles, the last thing that we want to hear on the other side is an officer pleading for help or an officer down type of call. Whether it's coming from an officer's radio system, whether is that officer activated his emergency trigger, or a member of the public picking up the radio and asking for help on behalf of the officer, or someone calling in to 911 asking for help for that officer. That is the last thing that we want to hear. And from a mother's perspective, you know, we want our children to come home every single night unharmed. While I want to congratulate you on this legislation, I want to associate my comments also with Mr. Hastings' comments. As I'm reading the report, there were 129 officers that died in the line of duty. Of those, 46 officers died from gun violence. Yet, again, you know, we're not, if we truly care about blue lives, then we truly respect that blue lives do matter, then we ought to speak about that, and we should be having hearings about that, and we should be discussing the issues associated with gun violence as it impacts our community and our public servants. As a former city council member and mayor of my home city of Pomona, the last thing that you want to deal with and that I had to deal with was an officer that was murdered on the doorstep of our courthouse. An officer that was murdered by a 16-year-old because it was a part of a gang initiation. An officer that was murdered by the Mongols motorcycle gang because they were serving a search warrant. Or an officer who was in pursuit of a mentally unstable person who barricaded himself and murdered a 30-year-old officer on his last day of training. Those are the last things that we want to hear. And going back to my days as a 911 dispatcher, I was working the day of the North Hollywood shooting. That was the bank robbery shooting. Those officers were did not have the weapons to fight back against those armed robbers that were heavily armed and were equipped from head to toe with armored. So if we truly care about blue lives, we have to ensure that in this Congress, we are supporting our officers with training to deal with the issues that they have in the community, proper training, and the proper tools that they need in order to do their job. It's not enough to say, you know, we're going to pass this law, but at the same time, we're starving them with the resources that they need in order to address the issues that they're having in the community. Building that trust in the community is no easy task for them. We're beyond the old style of policing, of community policing, when people call the police to break up a fight, they picked up both parties and they took them to jail, and that was the end of it. Our police officers have to do more than that. They have to deal with mentally unstable people. They have to deal with domestic violence issues. They have to deal with transients. They're the ones that we call for everything and anything under the sun. But yet, we fail to provide them with the resources that they need in order for them to do their job and prevent the murders that this bill is trying to accomplish. So I want to congratulate you on this, but I also want to encourage you to continue the work to ensure that we reduce this number. 129 officers, again, an additional 140 officers committed suicide. Suicide. Those are also preventable things that this Congress can actually do to help them do their job. The stress of being a police officer and seeing the types of crimes that they see day in and day out, it's not enough to give them a paycheck. We have to do more than that. I yield back.
Joan, let me just back your time. Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you.
May I just
Yes, ma'am.
comment, if I might, and thank the members for their comment. I do want to acknowledge that there are sufficient state and federal laws that can prosecute, and this particular legislation narrows its provision to the targeting of police officers. But to expand to create a safety net for police officers, I believe and hope that my colleague, that we will come to this Rules Committee with the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which provides for the enhanced training, professional development, and certainly to take note of Ms. Torres' point. She's right, 140 officers committed suicide, and to take note of Mr. Hastings' point. Both tragically, the incidences in Baton Rouge and in Dallas, the perpetrator had assault weapons that were targeting the officers, and this is a ex-military with assault weapon, and again, creating dangers that should not be. So I'm hoping that we will be able to come to really address the concerns of some of our civil rights organizations going forward, but as well coming forward with a package, Mr. Rutherford, that looks at the holistic way of protecting communities and police with the training, the de-escalation, the professional development, the addressing of the suicides, and additional funding to deal with police departments for the equipment that they need. And then finally, the use of laws that exist in the state to make sure that people doing these heinous acts are not doing it with immunity, and in the name of the father of community-oriented policing, former Chief Lee P. Brown, Chief of Police of Atlanta, New York, and Houston, former drug czar, there is still room for the opportunity for engagement of community and police that we should work on as well. And I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I thank Mr. Rutherford for his leadership. We look forward to working together on our other legislation.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you for being here. If you'll please recall that anything you brought in writing for also the stenographer would be appreciated, and I want to thank each of you very much. Thank you. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony to H.R. 5698, Protect and Serve Act of 2018? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion of H.R. 5698. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. We will now move to S2372, Veterans Cemetery Benefit Correction Act, what's known as the VA Mission Act of 2018. We would welcome the distinguished chairman of the committee, the gentleman from Tennessee, and Mr. Takano. We'd also welcome Mr. Gonzalez, gentleman from California. We've got a chair for him, the gentleman from Texas. Clerk, Ms. Booth, will make sure the gentleman from California has a chair. There it is. Thank you, Ms. Booth. Gentlemen, previously we have made a determination that we knew you'd be here. We've spoken about the bill. We've already given the orders without objection. Anything you brought in writing would be available to the stenographer to complete the record today. The distinguished gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify here today on the Department of Veterans Affairs Mission Act of 2018. Mr. Chairman, it doesn't seem quite right being here today without Louise Slaughter sitting here, and I know she's looking over my shoulder. And I had a chance to visit one of her CBOC clinics just a few months before she died, and I just wanted to say that to you all. It just doesn't seem quite right to be here without Louise being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for remembering.
The VA Mission Act has 5 main features. First, it would consolidate the confusing morass of VA community care programs into a single cohesive program that would increase choice and access to timely, quality health care while preserving VA's role as a coordinator of care for our nation's veterans. Second, it would provide sufficient funding to allow the choice program to continue serving veterans over the next year as a new community care program is being stood up. In doing so, it would prevent a veteran access to care crisis that would otherwise occur as soon as May 31st, according to the acting secretary. That's when the choice program runs out of money. Third, it would institute an objective, transparent process based on a recommendation from the Bipartisan Commission on Care to holistically review and recommend changes to VA's massive physical infrastructure portfolio. This would transform the current VA healthcare system, which is characterized by outdated, misaligned, and inefficient medical facilities, into a modern, high-performing healthcare system that our veterans deserve. Fourth, it would expand VA family caregiver program to pre-9/11 veterans. This would correct an unfair inequity that has caused heartache and distress for pre-9/11 caregivers who've been serving and sacrificing for their veteran loved ones for years, without the recognition and support they so greatly have needed. Finally, it would improve VA's ability to competitively hire high-quality clinicians and support staff by making a wide variety of improvements to VA recruitment and retention programs and allowing for innovative pilot programs in rural and medically underserved areas. This would increase VA's internal capacity to care for veteran patients in VA medical facilities across the country. The VA Mission Act represents a negotiated bipartisan agreement between the Committees on Veterans Affairs of the House and Senate. It is the culmination of a year and a half's worth of work, process, and regular order, and it's widely supported by veteran advocates and stakeholders, including 38 of the largest, most active military and veteran service organizations who signed a letter in strong support of the bill last week. I request that the letter, which rightly recognizes the VA Mission Act as a historic opportunity for Congress to measurably improve the lives of millions of veterans and their families, be inserted into the record.
Awesome.
I thank you, and I believe the VA Mission Act is a bill that veterans can be proud of, and I thank you once again for allowing me to testify on it today and look forward to answering questions you may have.
Mr. Chairman, we've got them, and we're going to bring them to you. Mr. Cano, welcome. We're delighted that you're with us today, and perhaps most importantly, thank you for appearing on behalf of the veterans of this great nation, men and women who served not only in difficult times, but who many times gave their sacrifices of the ultimate, and those who came back and are sacrificing themselves today. The gentleman's recognized.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Sessions. And it's one of the great privileges of being a member of Congress is to serve on this committee and to constantly be asking myself the question, what more can we do to honor the service of our veterans? And I appreciate your sentiments. Well, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern and members of the committee, I thank you for affording me the opportunity to advocate for the consideration of the VA Mission Act under an open rule when it comes to the floor tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, the House Veterans Affairs Committee will host its first ever Members' Day. We have 42 members scheduled to testify about the concerns of veterans in their districts and their ideas to address the multiple issues plaguing the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, imagine if all 42 of those members and other members in this Congress were able to offer amendments to this bill on the floor tomorrow. We would be able to consider, debate, and vote on those ideas. Those ideas could make this bill better. That's why I believe it's so important that we have an open rule. We've been told before, even coming here that today, that the Mission Act will only be considered under a closed rule. Well, this shuts down our ability to have our ideas debated and put to a vote. A closed rule takes away our opportunity for members to have their ideas heard and considered. I have filed one amendment with this committee that I hope will be made in order. It would address my concern about transferring funding from the Veterans Choice Fund to VA's discretionary community care account and paying for all community care with discretionary dollars under this new program. My concern is that paying for all community care with discretionary dollars under this program will go back on the bipartisan budget deal we agreed to just a few short months ago. With a decision to fund this new community care program under one discretionary fund, which is the right thing to do, VA will be forced to significantly cut other programs so as to not exceed its budget caps. The cost of community care is so expensive, we will not make it through fiscal year 2019 with the VA's current budget caps in place. So when we talk about significant cuts to other programs, these cuts could be to health care provided at VA hospitals and clinics. It could be VA research. It could be construction and maintenance needed for existing VA facilities. It could also mean cuts to other federal programs that help veterans, programs that help house homeless veterans, programs that help fund veterans treatment courts and provide veterans with job training and employment assistance. Now, this amendment would hold VA harmless when VA community care funding exceeds VA's budget caps. It simply allows VA to fund the new community care program and its other programs without having to make drastic cuts to other veterans programs. There was language added to the manager's amendment at the last minute that exempts the $5.2 billion authorization of mandatory spending from counting against statutory pay-go to prevent across-the-board sequester of mandatory programs like Medicare. If the manager's amendment is going to exempt spending increases on the mandatory side, we should also exempt spending increases on the discretionary side, which is what my amendment does. It also keeps the bipartisan deal in place, allowing for the $4 billion we got in that deal to be spent on VA's infrastructure needs, which is what we all agreed to when we voted on the Bipartisan Budget Act. Now, I hope this committee will make this amendment in order so that we can have a debate on how this program will be sustainably funded, and so we can vote on it on the floor. Now, I have concerns about the process that brought us here today and the process we're expected to use when the House considers this bill on the floor tomorrow. I think this bill needs a greater emphasis on building the VA's capacity to provide veterans the specialized care that many of them need. We need to do more to recruit and retain the best providers to care for our veterans. And I wish we had a strong VA leadership in place before moving forward with sweeping reforms. But at the end of the day, Mr. Chairman, I realize that we can't keep doing emergency patches to fund community care. We can't continue to look veterans in the eye and when we don't offer caregiver support services just because they served before 9/11. And at the end of the day, that is why I'm going to reluctantly, and I say reluctantly, vote for this bill when it comes to the floor. But I urge this committee to allow this bill to be considered under an open rule so that all of us have an opportunity to be heard and have our ideas considered and to make this a better bill. So I thank you, Chairman Sessions, for this opportunity to testify before the committee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern, for the opportunity to speak on the amendment 2372, which is an evolution of a bill I filed called Repatriate Our Patriots Act that I filed with my good friend on the other side of the aisle, Don Young. And this critical amendment would allow deported veterans who were honorably discharged or released to go through the naturalization process. And I want to make it very clear, this is not an immigration bill. This is clearly a veterans bill. And I'm glad to have a Texan sitting in front of me because I know the love that we have for veterans in our state. This amendment would also make the government keep records of veteran status of veterans that we deport, since the Department of Homeland Security shamefully does not track veteran status in deportation proceedings. For this reason, we currently do not know exactly the number of veterans that have been deported from our country. Many of these are highly decorated, all honorably discharged that we're talking about today. Those that we would bring back could not have been convicted of a crime such as voluntary manslaughter, murder, sexual assault, or abuse of a child, or terrorism against our country. I made very clear in my bill to put these acts that were so gruesome that I'd be willing to deport Americans for the same crime. This list of crimes happens to be the most contentious part of our amendment. However, it is important to note that citizens do not get deported for these crimes. All of these veterans qualify for citizenship and have earned it in the most profound way. The failure to attain citizenship is not the fault of our veterans. Many were misled over overzealous recruiters into believing they were citizens after taking the oath of service. Many of these honorably discharged veterans are highly decorated, and all of them have clean records prior to serve them. In the federal government, if the federal government had done its job, none of these vets would have been facing deportation regardless of their crimes. Citizens do not get deported. None of them originally came to the U.S. illegally. They were all here legally. 100% of our veterans who joined our armed services and served honorably and wore our uniform and fought for our freedom and did a very good job and were honorably discharged. Most of the crimes veterans are being deported for stem directly from PTSD, from post-traumatic stress disorder, and the lack of services that we gave them to transition them back into society when they came back to our country. We're still losing 20 to 22 veterans a day to suicide over the same issue. So to add insult to injury, we as a government not only failed to ensure the naturalization, but also failed to ensure the proper transition. The VA scandal of 2014 proves that. Reinstating the legal status for these veterans is the only way to ensure that they can receive the rightfully earned VA benefits. And it's important to note that these veterans are not just in Mexico or Latin America. I have record of veterans who served honorably, who were here legally, who fought for our country in 38 countries around the world. I can't imagine anything more shameful and more un-American than deporting somebody who wore our uniform, fought for our freedom, fought for this country, and then were later thrown out. Reinstating the legal status for these veterans is the only way to ensure that they can receive the rightfully earned VA benefits. To pass a massive VA healthcare bill that stresses the importance of access to service without considering all the veterans, including those that have been deported, is disingenuous. If you use veterans as a political talking point in your reelection campaign and your policy agendas, then voting against this amendment not only shows a lack of integrity, but also a lack of respect for the service of our nation's veterans. And I know this House is as divisive as it's been in a long time, and certainly in modern history, but I certainly hope that our American veterans who fought for our freedom, who continue to support this bill in a bipartisan way, including my good friend Don Young, the Dean of the House, one of the most conservative members on the other side, support this issue. This is the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do for America, and I certainly hope that it has everyone's support here in this room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, there's been some discussion today about the status of the committee entertaining amendments to this. It was my understanding, but I'm going to ask that you please clarify. It's my understanding that this bill has been, well, I don't know the correct word, pre-conferenced, pre-qualified, because there actually is a definable agreement of the exact way this is given, I believe, then the manager's amendment that is attached to that. Can you please discuss that with the committee, because you've got two members that willingly are coming up asking for there to be amendments or to make this an open process. And I just think it's important that we understand what you're trying to move with us today so that it becomes law.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We started this process 15, 16 months ago, and I sat down with every member on the committee in a bipartisan way or in small groups and worked through starting with the community care bill. And basically, over the period of a year, we worked it out. We had a markup in late November, early December, which was not bipartisan. We went back to the drawing board, got with our Senate colleagues. We worked hand in hand with both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to carve out a compromise bill that will improve access and quality for our nation's veterans. So it's been carefully constructed. We also added the caregiver bill, and I think that's one, the more I've thought about that. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran. I served in Korea, 11 miles south of the DMZ. And the guys and gals that served with me don't have the same privileges that the folks that are injured catastrophically post 9/11. I found that wrong. And so we've added that to this bill. We've also funded a successful choice program. It had its hiccups and starts when it started, but it's functioning fairly well. And right now, the VA has 7 different ways it provides community care. Well, we want to make it one way so it's easily understandable, that the veteran understands it, the doctors understand it, the system understands it, and so that we did that. And then the asset review, I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, is an extremely important part of this. Let me explain why. Hospitalizations peaked in 1981. The population has grown 40% since that time, and we have 10% less people in the hospital today than we did 35 years ago. We have 1,500 fewer civilian hospitals, and yet the VA footprint hadn't changed at all. And I'll give you a perfect example. I've literally gone from Long Island to Los Angeles in this last year, visiting centers all over the place. And we go to the Denver VA, which is 1,100 feet long. It's unbelievable. We built a facility like that has half as many primary care teams as they had at the old facility. So now we have to keep the old facility open and this huge new facility. About a month ago, I went to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where they have this incredible outpatient clinic that does outpatient surgery, imaging. They have twice as many primary care teams, which is where most of our care is given, than that huge hospital does in Denver, Colorado. So care is not given. I use myself as an example. I've done thousands of operations. I've never had a major surgery until about 18 months ago. I've had 2, and I spent less than 48 hours in the hospital for both of them combined. So we've got to get a system that we can pay for. And to Mr. DeCano's point, I want to bring this up. I think it's very important. Republicans and Democrats have always provided the resources to take care of that nation's veterans. When I came on the committee in 2009 as a freshman member in 2009, we spent $97.5 billion on all VA services. That's disability claims, health care, and cemeteries. The president's ask this year is $198 billion. So we have over doubled the budget in the last 10 years for our veterans. So that's why it's a carefully constructed we negotiated with the Senate late into the night on the phone with Senator Isaacson and Tester. They've been great partners in this, and I'm afraid that any changes like this this bill would not get across the finish line. And remember, in 2 weeks, we run out of money for our choice program. And could I say one other thing? I think I would be glad to take your bill up in committee. I've never seen it, so I will give you that. I'll be glad to look at that in our VA committee.
See a lot of good things happen at the Rules Committee, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. I hope
Don't
we
ever
can get the votes.
underestimate your ability to come up here and
I don't.
make
This is
progress.
as noble of an issue as we could all imagine in this House, and I think it's something that everyone should be able to agree on. I have friends on the other side of the aisle. I've spoken to the president multiple times. He agrees with this. He told me several times that if this bill came to his desk, he would sign it. I welcome you to have a conversation with him about it. We cannot be deporting American veterans who fought for our country, who honorably served, who were honorably discharged, who had no prior history to being enlisted and come out, and without the care that they deserve, they end up in a little trouble. And on my bill, we're limiting it to mostly minor crimes. I would say 95, 98% of these young men and women who get in trouble is due to drugs and alcohol, usually self-medicating after coming home from wars. And the way I was first introduced to this issue was when I was campaigning, and we had a young man in my district who, Purple Heart recipient, who served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and went into enemy fire, saved American lives, and came home. He was a legal citizen in this country at age 4, was heavily recruited in high school, was a Marine, Purple Heart recipient, and started drinking, and he had 3 DUIs, and the next thing you know, he found himself in a deportation center, and that really caught my attention, and I've been pretty involved since then. And since we filed this bill, we have a record of folks who have been deported to 38 countries. So if there's any stigma about it being Mexico or Latin America, trust me, it's all over the country. These are people who came to this country legally, who were here legally. This is not an immigration bill. This is a veterans bill that served our country honorably and gave us the freedom to be here today, and we should not forget them.
Mr. Cano, did you wish to make your comment?
I would like to, first of all, thank the chairman, Chairman Rowe, for the work he's done on the bill before us. I also want to thank him for actually approving an official congressional delegation to Tijuana that I led, where I visited the Veterans Support House. And I commend you, Mr. Chairman, also for being willing to consider this bill in Veterans Committee. It's simply, people just don't believe it when we say that veterans who have served our country and were discharged honorably have been deported. They're just in disbelief, but it's true. There's a GAO report that has been accepted by the GAO. But I want to move back to the topic at hand. Let me just say that the The Congressional Budget Office has estimated the VA Mission Act will cost nearly $47 billion over 5 years, including $22.5 billion over 5 years just for the new community care program. The current budget caps just do not allow for this level of spending without requiring cuts to existing VA programs. And the chairman is correct. We've never failed to do right by our veterans. I just don't understand why we need to leave this uncertainty about where the money will come from until a year later when we run up against the precipice. And you know, my amendment would simply square that circle now. It would you know deal with the non-discretionary funding cap, and I don't think it's asking that much. I don't think it would be a deal breaker, and I would welcome the chance. I hope that the committee would welcome the chance for us to debate this on the floor. You know, I'm not looking to open up the whole bill, but I think this is the thing.
That it would. You're not looking to it, but the practical effect is it would.
Yes, sir. I mean, it would, but I think at this stage in the game, we know we have to get this bill done. We don't want to see veterans go without their choice funding. I know we're up against that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm deciding to vote in favor of this bill. Even though there's some defects that I wish we could cure. I'm not looking to cure every one of them, but I think this is a major one.
Well, I think it's fair for you to know that this was brought to the Rules Committee by agreement, bipartisan, bicameral agreement of a pretty tight. I have been engaged with negotiations with the United States Senate a couple times, and where you've got a deal, we all of a sudden err on the side of getting a deal, and we do, because we believe a deal beats no deal. So I'm just trying to be forthright to hear from the chairman that that's the circumstances things that we're in today. This goes to a discussion that the gentleman from Massachusetts has with me often about how we open up bills and what we do. And today we're dealing with a piece of legislation that I believe, and I will enter into the record now, a statement of administrative policy, S2372. Turn to the second page. If the VA Mission Act of 2018 were presented to the President in his current forms, his advisors would recommend that he sign the bill into law. So that's what we're attempting to do, and I appreciate the gentleman. Did the gentleman wish to add?
Yes, I would just like to add one more thing. Since we're talking about VA benefits, we're talking about these veterans who are no longer in our country, who served our country honorably, signed that dotted line, and kept their end of the bargain. I feel we've breached their contract. They have no access to these benefits that we're talking about. They have no access to health care, to education, to housing, to all the things that we promised to them, that if they served and fought and defended our country, that we would promise to keep our end of the bargain, and we have not done that.
And I do respect that, and the gentleman, the young chairman of the committee, has indicated that he was unaware of the bill, would be very pleased to, I believe, engage you on that effort and to vet that accordingly. And I will take the gentleman at his word, the gentleman, Chairman Rowe. So that's that victory that I described earlier, perhaps a little bit short of the runway, but a victory under that, in that the young chairman has agreed to look at that. Mr. Buck, does the gentleman have any questions? Gentleman from Freedom, Colorado does not have any questions. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
I want to thank all of you for being here. I do find it a little strange that you know, there's always an excuse to close things up. You know, that we're bringing a bill that's supposedly pre-conference. Then, you know, I mean, what is the role of everybody in the House of Representatives? If I mean, there was no call for amendments, but yeah, we got 8 amendments here, so people have some good ideas.
Yield?
Yeah, happy to.
I would defer to the statement from the gentleman, the young chairman.
I heard the chairman. I heard the chairman.
Said that they are running out of.
I heard, but
need to get this done.
I heard that, but where there's a will, there's a way,
and
and again, we always go up against these deadlines, and it's just a little frustrating that there's always an excuse to close things down. And I would just say, Mr. Gonzalez, I support your amendment, and we've known this about this issue. This is not a new issue that came out of the blue. We've known about it, right? But we just haven't chosen to do nothing about it. And, you know, it seems to me that, you know, since everybody thinks it's a no-brainer, that's the right thing to do, let's make it in order and you know, and send it over to the Senate. I know you'll hear, well, it's not germane. Well, this is a veterans bill, and we're talking about veterans, and, you know, they waive the rules all the time here on germaneness. You know, this seems to me to be a perfect thing to do, and I don't think it would, I doubt very much it would derail the bill, you know, when it gets over the Senate. I appreciate the gentleman's willingness to take it up in committee, but I always get nervous when people say, we'll take it up in committee, because it means that maybe we won't see it for a long time. And so anyway, I thank you and I appreciate your work.
Thank you very much, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Takano and Chairman Rowe are seasoned veterans appearing before the committee. I'm using the language of Congress, not veterans per se, although they have their experiences in that regard as well. But I thought Mr. Gonzalez made a compelling case as a first-time member up here. He sounds like those seasoned veterans in his argument, and I too agree that his amendment should be made in order. I see no reason why it should not be. He has outlined what I think is a compelling case. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Without trying to do nothing but to help the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the committee, had not been engaged in the bill prior to this. And I think it is probably a bad idea to engage in this committee, us taking some amendment or some bill as it might be, notwithstanding it came also from the gentleman from Alaska, right, but that it would be vetted at least at some point by the committee. And
Mr. Chairman, I believe that to be the case. There's nobody in this body that I respect any more than Dr. Rowe. I know he has been working bipartisanly,
yes, sir,
toward these efforts, and in that regard, I believe he will address Mr. Gonzalez's concerns. But this is the Rules Committee, and I've certainly read about veterans being deported. As Mr. McGovern said, I don't think it's anything new. We had just a week or two ago one that was really outrageous, and they were able to cause him not to be deported. But in any event, we've had our say, and I think Mr. Gonzalez did a good job. Thank you.
And I would concur in that also. I called it a victory for him. Does the gentlewoman from California seek time?
Mr. Chairman, just to take this opportunity to thank Chairman Rowe for approving the CODEL to the border. The invitation was extended to me as a member of Foreign Affairs at the time. I can't remember, but either way, I want to also make a case for the Gonzalez bill, Gonzalez-Young bill. While I was there, I was able to visit a constituent of mine at the Tijuana hospital. He was a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who was deported for selling, CDs in the street. And when he was dropped off at the border, he was beaten up. He had nothing, not even ID on him, but they attempted to rob him. And my office was contacted by his sister, who's an American citizen, and I went to visit him at the hospital. We could not get him across the border for surgery, and that was right after the earthquake that devastated Mexico City. So all of the surgeons in Mexico were in southern Mexico and central Mexico. There wasn't anyone available, and he sat in that hospital room for 2 weeks waiting for someone to do surgery on his hip because he was left on the side of the road with a broken hip. That day, I also met a young veteran. Well, he's not a veteran because he was injured 2 years into his military enlistment. While training to be sent overseas for deployment, he was dragged by a vehicle, a military vehicle, for over a mile. he was in a coma for more than 30 days. The day that they were going to pull the respirators off of him and get him off of life support, he came back. The military eventually sent him home while they figured out what they were going to do with his broken body. When he was sent back home, he began to self-medicate. And that got him in trouble. And therefore, he not only was he thrown out of the military for being injured while on duty, he was also deported. So that young man has absolutely no access to anything. California, through the Covered California program, they have established a partnership with a clinic in Tijuana where veterans, should we give them permission, could get access to some kind of medical care. But again, these are all things that we need to work out. When this country decides to deport veterans or members of the military because they were injured so severely while serving our country, then we also need to be responsible what happens to them when we send them out of this country and help them have access to what is due to them, and that's their benefits. So thank you for agreeing to take up this issue in your committee, sir.
Thank you very much. Is there any other member that would seek time with this panel? I want to thank all three of you for taking time to be here. If you'll please make sure you leave whatever you brought in writing for our awesome stenographer, and I appreciate it very much. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony today to S 2372, Veterans Cemetery Benefit Corrections Act, known as VA Missions Act of 2018. Seeing none, this now close the hearing portion of that section. We would now open up testimony and necessary beginning of the discussion on H.R. 2, Agriculture and Nutrition Act 2018 for general debate. As the committee, I hope, understands, what we're attempting to do today is to begin the process whereby the young chairman of the committee, Mr. Michael Conaway, would give testimony. We would plan to have two rules, which means we will have a general debate today. We would then authorize some bit of what I would consider to be non-controversial amendments for the floor. Be on a rule number 1. Tomorrow we would have rule number 2, whereby those would be what I would say more intellectually stimulating amendments that would engage the committee. And so we would begin that process. I have chosen, Mr. Chairman, to wait on a more comprehensive discussion that I would intend to have with the committee, and so I'll yield myself that as an opening statement. The committee now will proceed to consideration of H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act of 2018. This legislation addresses the economic challenges facing farmers, and ranchers and their families, and communities across this great nation, while making historic investment and opportunities for recipients of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as food stamps. This legislation recognizes the unique inherent risks in agriculture, the hardship that American farmers and ranchers are currently experiencing, and the enormous contributions that the nation's farm and ranch families make to our great nation for food security. Additionally, this legislation makes historic investments to the people of this country, those who are using food stamps, but also seeking better opportunities. With historic unemployment rate of 3.9%, that's unemployment rate that is the lowest we have had in over 40 years, more Americans are working today than any point since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began making employment data. This is great news. But with the right policies, I think we can do better. There are currently almost 7 million jobs in this country that employers are desperate to fill, yet employment and enrollment of able-bodied adults on food stamps remains sky high, with most of these adults not working. Work requirements for able-bodied adults on food stamps are the single most effective way to quickly move these individuals out of dependency. I believe work transforms lives. I believe that we've got to find a way for government policies to begin viewing work that's important to people, that it helps people, it helps their future and helps their country. Work provides dignity, and what's unfair, I believe, is a government program that encourages dependency rather than incentivizing independence via self-sufficiency. For too long, bureaucrats here in Washington and states around the country have used and abused waivers and loophole exemptions from work requirements that have been on the books since 1996. The result, millions of Americans stuck on welfare and being kept from finding another job. And even worse, this abuse comes at a time when the truly needy need food stamps and more assistance. So every single dollar we spend on an able-bodied adult is a dollar that can't be spent on people who are a priority item, those who really do need help. Seniors, individuals that are not able-bodied, veterans, those that are disabled, pregnant women, poor children, and anyone that may not fall under the category of able-bodied. I think the American people deserve better. This farm bill closes loopholes and reins in out-of-control waivers. It expands work requirements to allow more able-bodied adults, finally making food stamps a springboard from what I think is back to work instead of a barrier to it. Right now, our welfare system robs people of the opportunity to work. I hear from employers all the time, not just in Dallas, Texas, but across Texas, that they have jobs that need to be filled and workers that they need to fill them. Giving able-bodied Americans a choice to work or train, I think, empowers them to regain their independence. Any able-bodied adult choosing not to participate is self-selecting and should self-select themselves out of the program. I've seen firsthand the power of work to empower people, including my son, a Down syndrome young man who is not able-bodied, cannot take care of himself, but who works because he believes it's the right thing to do, not only for self-dignity, but he's also given a chance. He works at Home Depot in Dallas, Texas. He works for 20 hours a week, which is the maximum that he would be allowed under federal law to work, but he gets up and participates. I see our nation as needing the same opportunity for self-sufficiency and working for all Americans. And if we have rules and regulations that say you can be on food stamps without work requirements, we will gather, I'm sure, a good number of the 6.5 to 7 million people who are able-bodied who are receiving food stamps, but those vast majority of them men between the ages of 19 and 49. So your change in this bill to move that we will have work requirements, I believe is essential to moving not only people to work, but essentially then making sure that we can aim at the people who need it most. Able-bodied adults should get out and have to hustle and not be able to receive something that is aimed for people who need it most. So I appreciate you taking time to be here, Mr. Chairman. I will allow, as I should, the gentleman from Massachusetts to offer any statement that he chooses to make. Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying that our ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, Colin Peterson, will not be attending the Rules Committee. I had a conversation with him, and he, in his words, does not want to legitimize what he believes is an illegitimate process. And for those who know Colin Peterson, he's one of the most honorable men that serves in this Congress. He's one of the most conservative Democrats in this Congress. He agrees more with you guys than he does with me on most issues. And if you can't strike a bipartisan deal with Colin Peterson, you can't strike a bipartisan deal with anyone. I will give an opening statement because I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm on the Agriculture Committee. I asked a series of questions, and no one knew any of the answers to them. So I don't think it's worth me getting into a question and answer session here. I want to focus on the nutrition title. As you did, Mr. Chairman, I serve as the ranking member of the Nutrition Subcommittee, and I found this entire process, quite frankly, to be offensive. As I said, I'm the ranking Democrat on the Nutrition Subcommittee. I didn't see one word of the nutrition title until it was released to the public. No Democratic member on the subcommittee was consulted in drafting any of the language in the nutrition title. And from my conversations I've had with many of my Republicans on the subcommittee, none of them seem to want to admit to having any role in drafting this language. We were given the text of this bill and expected to just go along with it. And I can't for the life of me figure out where some of these ideas came from. The controversial provisions in the nutrition title seem to have appeared out of thin air. They certainly did not come from 23 hearings on SNAP that our committee conducted prior to the drafting of this bill. Not one of the 89 witnesses we heard from suggested gutting the SNAP program or taking food away from hungry families, as this bill does. In fact, the experts that appeared before our committee agreed with me that SNAP is an important program that helps families put food on the table when times are tough. It is deserving of our support. Many of our witnesses suggested ways to make the program even better through modest improvements. Had the majority listened to them, we would be having a very different conversation here today. I'd like to take my time this afternoon to just set the record straight about some of the things that I've been hearing from some of my Republican colleagues on the Agriculture Committee about this bill. First of all, let's be clear. H.R. 2 cuts SNAP benefits. That is money for families to purchase groceries by over $23 billion. That's a fact. That's not a number I made up. It comes from the Congressional Budget Office and the nonpartisan experts that rely upon for analysis. Perhaps you've heard of the CBO. Now let's break that down further. This bill cuts $9.2 billion in benefits for vulnerable adults like veterans, teenagers just aging out of foster care, chronically homeless individuals, and older adults up to the age of 59 who are out of work. It takes that money, again, money that was used by these people to purchase food for themselves and their families, and it plows it into a massive, untested, and vastly underfunded new government workforce bureaucracy. This program will not be able to reach all of the SNAP beneficiaries who need access to job training in order to remain in the program. Now, don't take that from me. A CBO, and that's short for the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan experts, and they said, and I quote, states would not be able to offer training to all eligible recipients when the requirement takes effect in 2021 or even by the end of 2028, end quote. This bill also cuts over $5 billion in benefits for working families with kids by eliminating categorical eligibility, an important state flexibility option. According to the CBO, those nonpartisan experts, 400,000 households would lose SNAP eligibility if this provision becomes law. CBO also estimates that in an average year, 265,000 children would lose access to free school meals. As I said earlier, school bullies go after lunch money, not members of the United States Congress. The bill cuts $3.8 billion in benefits, primarily from households with kids, by mandating child support enforcement. But get this, according to CBO, it costs $7.2 billion to implement, almost twice as much as it saves. Why? I mean, who came up with this? Now, this may play well on Fox News, but spending $7 billion to recoup less than $4 billion is what I would call a terrible idea. Because of other changes in this bill impacting families with heating and cooling costs, 560,000 households will have their benefits reduced by an average of $84 per month. That's not according to me. Again, it's according to those nonpartisan experts at CBO. This provision is most damaging for disabled households or families with children who will have to collect additional paperwork and make unnecessary trips to the SNAP office. It seems to me this is simply another barrier to prevent families from accessing benefits. Now, analyzing these numbers from the nonpartisan CBO, there is simply no way to arrive at the conclusion that benefits won't be cut or that families will not lose access to food assistance. Now, I'd also like to correct some of the other misrepresentations I've heard from some of my colleagues about this bill. First, let me state this as clearly and as plainly as I can. The majority of people on SNAP who are expected to work do work. Of that population, nearly 3/4 of adults who participate in SNAP in a typical month work in either that month or within a year of participation in the program. Those who participate in SNAP for longer periods are children, are senior citizens, or they are disabled. Now, some of the higher figures my colleagues are citing about able-bodied adults are misleading. These numbers show participants in a month when they are on SNAP and most likely to be temporarily out of work. Now, I asked for a hearing on able-bodied adults without dependents. And I asked for it and I put it in writing, and that was the one hearing we didn't do in the Agriculture Committee. But I also have to note that SNAP participants are working in jobs that don't lift them out of poverty or provide them with enough money to buy food, and that some workers rely on SNAP for help when they are in between jobs. I think if you ask those beneficiaries, Mr. Chairman, if they prefer the $1.40 per meal that SNAP provides or a decent, stable job that pays them a living wage, I can guarantee you that they would resoundingly say they would prefer to work in a well-paying job. But even with low overall unemployment, many adults struggle to find stable work, and available jobs don't always align with the skills that these workers have or where they live. And the work training program that is concocted in this bill falls woefully short of addressing these issues. If every eligible adult chose to participate in this workforce program, states would receive a mere $30 per month per training slot to provide 80 or more hours of a work program. No quality job training program could operate with such little funding. In fact, studies suggest quality job training programs cost between $7,000 and $14,000 per participant. States would need to mass produce make-work programs to meet these responsibilities under this bill. They wouldn't be able to construct quality programs that actually help lift people out of poverty. This bill does not even require a state to offer a single skills-based program that would help workers in low-quality jobs switch to better-paying professions. This bill is an off-ramp to hardship, plain and simple. It includes harmful, untested, and unworkable proposals. I have seen no evidence that any of these programs will lead to self-sufficiency. In fact, the only evidence I have seen says that this bill will take benefits away from those in need. And make no mistake, this proposal will harm children. A loss of income or assistance to a parent is a loss to the whole household. And according to CBO, and those are those nonpartisan experts, Mr. Chairman, the majority of people who are expected to lose benefits under this work scheme are in households with children. Now, I'm having a hard time figuring out who this bill helps. Maybe it's a nice soundbite for the right-wing base, but it will hurt people. And I didn't come to Congress to hurt people. Cutting SNAP benefits for millions of kids, veterans, older Americans, disabled people, and working families is a rotten thing to do. This bill does not align with my values. I was not raised to turn my back on people who are struggling or to make them political scapegoats. Those struggling in poverty have it hard enough. They don't need the United States Congress making their lives worse and their families hungrier. This bill is unworkable, and in short of rewriting the entire bill, it is unfixable. I would suggest that we go back to committee and actually work through a deliberative process to produce a bill we all can be proud of, a bill that helps our farmers and bolsters our nutrition programs. Until then, I believe that Democrats will unanimously oppose this bill, and I hope that a lot of Republicans do as well. We can do a hell of a lot better than this, and I'm not going to ask any questions because I did ask them in committee and didn't get any answers to my questions. So with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Well, it's my hope that you're going to get some answers today, because anybody that thinks that we are going to deny disabled people food stamps have lost their marbles. And we are not doing that, and for someone to suggest that we would would not be correct. So I do take it that the gentleman has asked
I would say
question.
that if you go back to the bill, the LIHEAP provision does not exempt disabled people from this requirement of having to deliver.
I'll let
We asked
you-
that in committee, but go
I'll
ahead.
let
You
you-
can go
you
ahead.
said
and-
you didn't get
You
an
can believe
answer.
whatever you want on this. Yeah.
I will, but my point is, we have the young chairman here who will answer these questions. And I would also say, yes, you're right, we are saving money, because there will be work requirements. And I think it's unfair to ask somebody not to come participate with work requirements. And yes, I believe there will be families with children that could lose this, but they aren't small children, they're children. I don't even think we have any requirement for how much money somebody makes to be on food stamps right now. And we'll ask the chairman that too. So I think there's a whole lot of things we got to ask. I'm delighted that we have the gentleman from Midland, Texas here, the young chairman of the committee who has spent a lot of time doing this, the gentleman who comes to Congress with an extensive background, not only being a CPA, but a distinguished member of his community. The chairman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. I appreciate being here today. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today concerning our Farm Bill. H.R. 2, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act of 2018, is a product of a 3-year process. This includes 114 hearings, 6 listening sessions in the field, and countless meetings with folks representing Americans served by every facet of the Farm Bill. I know that the process has become partisan, and that's unfortunate. That said, the Ranking Member and I did work very closely together in crafting the lion's share of the Farm Bill, and I greatly appreciate his contributions. Ultimately, the committee reached an impasse over the nutrition title, primarily over the question of whether work-capable adults should be work or get free training for 20 hours per week to be eligible for SNAP benefits. I respect the views of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this question, even though I do not share their conclusions. I believe that the best measure of success for SNAP is how many people on the program can help land a better job that puts food on their table, a roof over their heads, and a better and brighter future for them and their families. I have an abiding faith in the dignity of work and the promise of a better life that work brings to people. I know my friends on the other side of the aisle feel as passionate about this topic as I do, although from a much different perspective. I hope that members on both sides of the aisle, including me, can learn from each other this week as we debate this issue. Outside of SNAP, I want to underscore to this committee just how important passage of the Farm Bill is right now. We're in the midst of a 5-year recession in agriculture. Farmers and ranchers have seen net income drop by 52%. This is among the steepest declines in net farm income since the Depression. 3 Wall Street Journal headlines help tell the story. One headline reads, "The next American farm bust is upon us." Another reads, "To stay on the land, American farmers add extra jobs." That article chronicles farmers taking a second and even third job, working 16 hours a day just to make ends meet. And finally, the article, which really hits home, reads, "Farmers across High Plains brace for hard times as drought bears down." Ladies and gentlemen, Middle Texas, my hometown, has seen about 1 inch of rain over the past 195 days. I know the members of this panel have seen natural disasters up close, including hurricanes and droughts and wildfires. It is heart-wrenching. Farmers and ranchers feel the effects of these natural disasters first and hardest. And this is a big part of why we have farm policy in this country. But it's important to understand that even farmers and ranchers in parts of the country enjoying relatively good growing conditions are struggling right now. Losing half your income will do that. A big part of the problem for our farmers and ranchers is that foreign countries, including China and India and other world players, have been doubling down on their already high subsidies, tariffs, and other trade barriers. These barriers to trade distort global markets, depressing the prices that our farmers and ranchers receive in the marketplace. Just last week, our government called out India for trying to hide its illegal subsidies by not reporting them to WTO. And not long ago, we discovered that China illegally over-subsidized just 3 crops by more than $100 billion in a single year. To put that in perspective, it would take us more than 8 years for the entirety safety net of what we, under this farm bill, to spend that kind of money. That is what our farmers and ranchers are up against, and these incidents are not exceptions to the rule. Meanwhile, here at home, we've been cutting back on support to farmers and ranchers. As you know, the 2014 Farm Bill pledged a $23 billion in taxpayer savings. However, the latest CBO, and I think that's probably the same CBO that my colleague from Massachusetts referenced, budget baseline says that the savings will actually exceed $112 billion, nearly five times what was pledged. These savings are partially the result of reforms in agriculture that build on previous market-oriented reforms that began in 1996. The farm safety net, specifically the commodity and crop insurance titles, today constitute about 1/4% of the entire federal budget. Yet, for this investment, Americans enjoy the lowest grocery bills in the world, and American agriculture provides us with a rare trade surplus while creating 21 million American jobs. I say all this because I'm not always certain that everybody in Washington fully appreciates just how much is at stake here and just how precarious the situation is right now in farm country. We're preparing to take a farm bill across the floor of the House amidst conditions where many farmers and ranchers across this country are just one bad year away from being forced out of business. And they are increasingly telling their children to head to the city because there's no way that a farm can support them all. And the number of full-time farmers and ranchers, the ones primarily feeding and clothing this country and much of the world, is dwindling. This despite the fact that we're speeding toward the day when 9 billion people will inhabit this planet, all needing to be fed and clothed. There are many things I'd like to tout about this farm bill, but I am proud of the committee's work product. But I want to leave you with this thought as we deliberate on the rule that will govern debate over this legislation. A cottage industry has grown up in Washington, D.C. that is bent around the axle over undoing farm policy. Many of these groups from both ends of the political spectrum are well-heeled, and they spend an inordinate amount of time and resources on this area of policy that is actually working well. I fully support a full-throated debate over the Farm Bill, but I also want everyone to be aware of just what's at stake. I have great respect for the chairman and ranking member and the members of this committee and trust that you will work to strike the proper balance to ensure that the Farm Bill debate is informed and is worthy one. I, like you, mourn the passing of the former ranking member, Louis Slaughter, who served this institution with dignity and terrific work for a number of decades. So, with that, Mr. Chairman, standing ready to answer your questions. And thank you for this opportunity to address the committee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. There are going to be people who move off food stamp rolls. Is that correct?
Yes.
However, with them moving off, it's because they would choose not to. Would
Two
that
groups.
be a true?
One of the goals of the bill is to do the best job we can to treat every American family every family in America exactly the same way. Federal policy shouldn't be dependent on which state you live in. And so we have states that have allowed families making more than 200% or making up to 200% of poverty to be on food stamps. We've got states that ignore the asset test, while we have other states that enforce those rules. And so the goal is to treat every family alike. And so those families that make too much money to be on the program, yes, they will be asked to come off the program. And then the others that you're speaking of, those who have been helped, who found a job, who found a training through these the programs that the states will run and control and set up amidst their existing processes. Or simply said, those SNAP benefits just aren't worth the effort. And so those are the three groups that would be affected.
So it sounds like you drew a line, 200%.
Well, 130% is where the line is.
130%.
Other states have, and Texas is at 165. So you and I have got skin in reducing these numbers from our own state. But 130 is the mark and an asset test. The asset test was, those numbers were set in 1977, had not been updated since. We inflate those numbers to a more rational number today. As an example, the car that does not count against your asset test could be valued at $4,650 today. We move that to $12,000 because that appears to be a better car that gets folks to and from work. We exempt the first $2,000 of cash that a family would accumulate because that's just good family financial planning. Right now, that cash counts against them on their asset test. And then we inflate that number of assets that do count against your test to about $7,000 from $2,000. So we do good work on that side. We keep the 130 as the mark, and we simply say every family in America who is below those marks gets food stamps. If you're above those marks, then you make too much money or your assets are too large to participate in the program.
So the changes that were made came as a result of feedback as you did these hearings across the country?
That and private conversations we've had. I've got great staff that's working on this, but 3 years worth of trying to gather as much input. The goal that I set in 2015, when John Boehner was still the speaker, was to address SNAP without any dollar signs involved. We wanted to find the very best policy we could put in place, irrespective of how much it might or might not cost, knowing, of course, at some point in time we'd have to figure that out. But I wanted to be able to say, here's the best policy we could come up with. Then if we couldn't afford it, the changes that you would make to get into what you could afford would be focused on that end goal of getting to the best policy. That's what we put in place, and we scored it at CBO. All that money stays within SNAP. And while the ranking member cherry-picked certain numbers to say that we take money out of SNAP, truth of the matter is all the money stays within SNAP. It just gets redirected toward a more efficient way to help people get off these programs.
So it
by getting more skills.
reprioritizes.
That's right.
Reprioritize. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here today. First Farm Bill passed when, in 1933?
Maybe. No, I think we've probably had a farm policy of some sort almost from 1820 when the committee was formed. So we've had some farm policy throughout that time frame.
So, I mean, I get asked the question all the time, is it still necessary to have a farm bill in the 21st century?
Yes.
And the reason for that is?
Well, varied. One, a nation that can feed itself is more secure and safer than one that has as a result of imported food. But right now, we've got a globalized marketplace in which China, India, and other countries are skewing the market prices for which our folks get paid for the prices. You talk to any American farmer out there, if it was a level playing field across the world, they'll compete with that, and they would like to make their money solely in the market. But other governments have skewed those numbers, what particular product that they've done that. And so our bill actually helps protect Americans from unfair trade practices around the world. As an example, I mentioned that China, one year, has spent $100 billion on 3 products over what they were supposed to. They're allowed to spend some, but this is $100 billion too much to make that happen. Our guys can't compete head-to-head with those kind of state-based resources that is out there. But at its core, this is a national security issue. A nation that can feed itself is one that's much more secure than one can. And this simply keeps production agriculture in the fight. The other thing about rural America, this is where the production agriculture actually occurs. And if we're going to keep and maintain a vibrant rural America, quite frankly, where all those values on which this country was built and sustained over these 230 years, then we've got to have a strong industry, production agriculture industry that is profitable. And so keeping these guys in the fight during hard times, whether it's natural disasters or man-made disasters through bad trade policies, is an important piece of what we try to do every 5 years.
Charlie Stenholm, when I first arrived here, he used to go to the floor of the House and talk about America having the safest, most abundant, and most affordable food supply in the world. So that was true in 2003. Is it still true today?
Absolutely. The American consumer, now, we all like getting deals, and every time we go to the grocery store, every time we eat in a restaurant, we spend less for food than anybody else in the world. We all like getting a deal, but we don't know why. A, we don't know we're getting the deal. B, we don't know why. It's because of the hard work, sweat equity, risk-taking that our American farmers out there, and yes, this safety net keeps them in place. Here's the family that I think about when we want to talk about changes to the agriculture policy. Those folks living at a paycheck to paycheck, about half of America lives paycheck to paycheck. Their food budget is where they flex because their house payment doesn't change and their car payment doesn't change. So if something comes up during the middle of the month that they need extra money for, then it's going to come out of the mom's food budget. And I don't want to make her job any tougher than it already is by arbitrarily, capriciously raising the cost of food here in America. We've got a really dynamic organic program going on in this country, one of the real bright lights, but those are folks on the high end that can afford whatever they want to spend for food, and fantastic. But we've got to make sure that mom living paycheck to paycheck, or these SNAP recipients, that their money goes as far as it possibly can to buy this affordable food. And if we want to screw up that part of the element, then we'll be back in here talking about increasing benefits on SNAP because they can't afford much higher prices that would be driven with if we lose American production.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we're going to be talking about this a lot over the next, 2 days? And I appreciate all the work that everyone has put into it. It is important policy. It's important we get it right. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to advise the committee that we're on a vote with time remaining at 0. About 100 members have not voted at this point, and so what I'm going to do is ask the distinguished gentleman if he will please come back so that we can continue the opportunity to engage you on this important issue.
Absolutely, Mr.
So
Chairman.
the committee will be subject to call the chair immediately after the last vote. Committee will come to order. There's a push that's on each of us, and I recognize that, Mr. Chairman. I know that a number of members have evening activities that they are attempting to get to. With great respect, we're going to do it right. Here we go. Thank you for taking time to come back. Does the gentleman have any questions?
I just wanted to respond to something you said, Mr. Chairman, because I think it's important. This bill would eliminate categorical eligibility, and you kind of hinted at the fact that there was kind of no income limits in terms of.
No, sir. I ask about
right.
them.
But I just want to say, I don't know, 200% of the poverty line, that's about $23,760. That's not a lot of money. And right now, some states, like Massachusetts and others, Texas employs categorical eligibility. I'm not sure what the limit is in Texas. But in Massachusetts, you can go up to 200% of the poverty level and be able to be eligible for SNAP. And states have this flexibility, as well as to waive the asset test, which alleviates a lot of the bureaucracy and a lot of the administrative burden. But what this bill does is it says that all states, including those, and Texas is one of these states, by the way, which is above 130% of the poverty line. This bill says it's 130% of the poverty line. That's $14,850. And in Texas, there's a lot of things that will impact Texas, but just by eliminating categorical eligibility, 125,000 people will lose their benefits. I think that's a pretty big deal. And, I mean, you can vote how you want, but if you vote for this bill, I'm glad you're not my congressman. The other thing is, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter that was sent to members of Congress from the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. This is a coalition of over 100 groups, some of which are the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association of People with Disabilities, the American Association on Health and Disabilities. I can go on and on and on, but over 100 groups who strongly oppose this bill.
Without objection.
Because they believe that this will have a negative impact on the disability community. So I insert that in the record, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. And I would just tell the gentleman, we've had testimony from the gentleman, Mr. Neal, who talked about 60,000 jobs that are going begging in the Northeast. 60,000 jobs in Dallas, Texas. And once again, we're not talking about disabled people.
Right, but you
you
said at the beginning of this that those who question the impact of this bill on people with disabilities, have lost their marbles. I don't think this group has lost their marbles. And in terms of the jobs that go unfilled, some of these jobs require, educational skills. I mean, not just, work training skills.
Some of them do.
And by the way,
Dallas, Texas, there are 20,000 jobs that pay $16 an hour with benefits. But it means you got to go work. And what we're trying to do is get a vast number of men who ought to get off, who are able-bodied. That's the discussion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, please stop demonizing this population, because it is. I mean,
able-bodied men.
You make it sound like that these are just people who are lazy, who don't want to work. The
I
bottom
did not
line,
suggest
in
that
that
at all.
population, there are people with undiagnosed mental illnesses. There are people who have just graduated out of foster care. There are veterans. We have a lot of veterans groups that are objecting to this bill because they fall into a category where they're returning and having a difficult time reentering into the community. So, you make it sound like, that we could paint everybody with one, big brush. This is a complicated population. And if we had done a hearing on this population, maybe we could speak with greater clarity. To basically kind of just say, well, these people just ought to go to work. There are a lot of people, the vast majority of able-bodied people are working. They don't earn enough to be able to not qualify for this benefit. Maybe we ought to talk about making sure that work pays. So, and this education and training program in this bill is so underfunded, it is not even funny. I mean, if everybody who technically qualified for this program took advantage of it, it's about $30 a person, when most training programs are between $7,000 and $14,000. So I just point that out because sometimes facts are a difficult thing to kind of grapple with. It's easier to engage in these generalities, But this, you know, this population of people that we're talking about, it's a complicated population.
I'm sure it is complicated, and my Down syndrome son has a complicated life, and he gets up and goes to work.
Well, you tell someone who earns $23,000 a year that they no longer qualify, and we're going to reduce it down to $14,850. I mean, that's what we're doing to help people. I think people deserve a lot better from us than that.
And I appreciate that. And we, in no way will we stop that debate. Did the gentleman get to engage the young chairman of the committee to his satisfaction? I did. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Alabama. The gentleman does not seek time. The distinguished gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Chairman. Chairman Conway, some of the argument that we just heard deals with the circumstances. Am I correct that the Work Opportunities Investment Act is underfunded at this time, according to the figures? Is it?
I'm not sure, but it would not surprise me if it's not in fact underfunded. This would allow funding to follow recipients into that program.
All right. Now, we did in the 2014 Farm Bill, we created 10 pilot programs. Are those pilot programs completely evaluated before we head off in this new direction?
No, previous administration got off to a slow start. 2-year implementation on the work program that we're planning for the states to do. We expect those 10 pilot projects to show fruit during that 2-year time frame, and that our states would be able to access that information and harvest from that the programs that would not work in an individual state. So it'll be ready by the time the states are putting their plans together.
And you don't feel that we should wait for that
No, sir.
experiment?
No, sir. I think the evidence is clear that folks who have jobs do better, particularly in a state like Maine, which has gone through a similar effort. Their results were pretty dramatic in terms of work requirements, and the improvement it's made in lives and moving forward. So to wait seems to me a bit wrong-headed, particularly when you'll have advantage, you'll have access to the fruits of those pilot projects before the plans are fully implemented.
All right. My big question with HR 2, it requires SNAP recipients to either work 20 hours a week or train 20 hours a week with an entirely new state-run bureaucracy in order to obtain the average monthly benefit of $135. Mr. Chairman, what if there are no jobs available in that community?
So each state will have a floor of up to 15% of this work-capable population to be able to manage those life problems that happen. Somebody's working on a construction job, breaks an arm, and they can't work for 2 or 3, 4 weeks, whatever. The state can manage that circumstance to keep that person on work requirements. So they'll have up to 15% where they can waive the work requirements. We still maintain the geographical waiver that would be available. We tighten it down. Today, the entire state of California is under a work waiver using the broad interpretation. That doesn't make any sense when we've got a 4% unemployment rate. So for those areas that truly do have the unemployment experiences that you're talking about, they could get a waiver in that regard. But the states will have up to 15% of their population to be able to deal with those individualized kind of problems that no national policy could remotely hope to accomplish with.
You kind of, I understand everything you said, and I agree with everything you said. But at the very same time, there are places where there are no jobs, period.
Right.
And what happens then to those individuals?
Well, that's the waiver of the work requirement of up to 15% of the population. So if you've got a place that's either don't have enough jobs, the state can waive the individuals in that work-capable group for them individually, or if it meets the criterion for the particular area that's mechanically in there in terms of unemployment, then the work requirement would not apply to the folks in that area. So right. It looks like you've got a couple ways to solve the thing you're concerned about.
Well, I want to put some things on the record with reference to statistics, with reference to Florida and SNAP. The Agriculture Committee held 23 hearings on SNAP.
We think 21, but okay.
Okay, 21. The minority asked for an additional hearing to better understand the characteristics of the able-bodied adults without dependents, which never occurred. Over the course of these hearings, none of the ideas included creation of new mandatory state government bureaucracies for employment and training programs. You had 89 witnesses before the Agriculture Committee, and am I correct that not one of them testified that this body should eliminate categorical eligibility for SNAP benefits to pay for it?
Honestly, I don't recall the 89 testimonies that specific, so, but if you guys have looked at it specifically, I'll take your word for it.
All right. In Florida.
And by the way, it's broad-based. There are 3 different levels of categorical eligibility. We don't eliminate the 2, the narrow and the traditional. Those are still in there. It's the broad-based categorical eligibility where you hand somebody a piece of paper and it sweeps them into the system. So we don't, unlike the acts that went after in 2013, we go after the broad base, which is the most egregious, but we leave the other 2 in. So when you use that phrase, categorical eligibility, to encompass all of that, it's not exactly accurate.
All right. In Florida, SNAP worked to support food security and financial stability for over 3 million people in over 1.5 million households, and that was in fiscal year 2017. That's about 15% of Florida's population. Participants in Florida received a total of $4.78 billion in benefits, resulting in an estimated $8.56 billion in net economic activity. According to the United States Department of Agriculture model, these benefits could have generated and supported an estimated 42,600 to 46,900 jobs, including 3,660 to 4,490 jobs in the agriculture sector. You may or may not know that I, along with my colleague Mario Diaz-Balart, represent a significant portion of particularly the winter vegetable areas in Florida and the cane sugar industry we represent as well, and a significant number of jobs are involved there. And interestingly enough, right around the area where all of this agricultural activity takes place, there are no other jobs. And I think what Chairman Sessions fails to take into consideration, and let me give him another statistic. He used that 16,000 jobs are available in Texas that are
Dallas.
In Dallas alone. Well, in the nation, there are 6 million jobs that we don't have people trained up to be able to take. And I think we're being very short-sighted in this nation by not taking into consideration, even in the field of agriculture, how much artificial intelligence and other implements have cut activity for people that work even in the field. I grew up around farms, and I have seen the circumstances change considerably for the independent farmer, the small farmer. But more than 62% of SNAP participants in Florida are families with children, and almost 35% are in families with members who are elderly or have disabilities. And more than 40% are in working families. And since I know for a fact that many Florida families struggle to put food on the table, and I could supply the data, and perhaps I will at another point in time, but not to belabor the point. Mr. McGovern made the argument last week about your statement, Chairman, that if persons did not support the Farm Bill, that their amendments, or paraphrasing, should not be made in order. First off, I think that flies in the face of the process. And like Mr. McGovern, I was astounded, and especially coming from you. And then you double down on it. and that troubled me as well. But I recognize that you have difficulty, but Mr. McGovern didn't seem to be able to know where this cut in SNAP came from. Is there any reason why he, as the ranking member of a subcommittee that would have addressed this problem in hearings, is there any reason why he did not know? And can you tell us now, where did it come from?
Well, a couple things, Mr. Hastings. One, my job is to get a farm bill done. And I don't sit on the Rules Committee. I don't make those difficult decisions that you have to make. I just get to have my opinion. And so if someone is someone's a hard no on the bill, then allowing them to introduce poison pill amendments, et cetera, seems to be a bit counter. If someone could be a yes on the bill if their amendment passes, that's y'all's call. But you get to vote. I don't. So I don't know why my opinion to get my bill passed offended you in that regard. It seems to me that Mr. McGovern went through in detail where the cuts come from earlier. And again, with all statistics, he said where the money came from. He just didn't say where it was going to go. And so $7.6 billion in training, however minuscule it might be to the ranking member in terms of resources to go against training. Both of you have mentioned the importance of training and helping people get better skills to get into the workforce. That's simply what we're trying to do.
That would be interesting to see. I believe that a substantial number of people that receive food assistance are already working.
Well, they qualify, and there's no time limit. If you're working 20 hours a week and the job you've got doesn't provide you the resources to get above the 130 mark, we're shoulder to shoulder with you for the rest of your life. There's no time limit for somebody working. We all argue really well to try to present our position, but when you talk about the elderly, they're not affected. When you talk about the working poor that have a job out there, they are not affected by what we're trying to get done. I get to represent, I'm blessed to represent an awful folks in rural America. And when I talk to somebody on farm country about 20 hours a week, they look at me and go like, well, that's what I do on my second and third job. Right. So this idea of working resonates well within rural America. And you know, when you sweep in populations during your arguments, they're unaffected. It's disingenuous, but it's how we try to defend ourselves, how we try to convince folks to vote.
It's a pretty harsh word, Mr. Chairman, but I understand it.
Well, when you use the word working poor,
I had that word taken down on the House floor once.
Well, when you use the words working poor, that are being kicked off the program.
Well, all the working poor are not in rural America either.
That's exactly
right. I represent rural and urban America, and a lot of my urban Americans statistics that I could reflect show that they too have problems where there are no jobs. What I'm trying to get across is that it ain't going to work. We tried welfare to work. We did it in Florida, and all of these things are interrelated. When you have a state like Florida and yours that did not expand Medicaid, that ties into the circumstances having to do with people and their ability to be able to participate in our economy in a meaningful way. I sometimes think y'all don't know what being poor looks like. And even though we live in these communities and we represent these people, it becomes difficult for me to understand where you come from. But it'll be on the floor. Y'all will have the big debate and what have you. And the poor people will get poorer, and the rich people will get richer. And that's what's been going on in this country for all the while that you all have been in the majority. To give people a measure, not you, Mr. Conaway, but your party, to give the wealthiest people in this country the kind of tax breaks that they got, and then for us to be here talking about whether or not people ought to be on food stamps, that's just plain absurd. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I know the young chairman did his homework before this, but I was hopeful we would also be able to, one way or another, get some facts out in the case of this. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics says nearly 75% of jobs being created require a high school education or less. Nearly 80% require no training and only 1 month of on-the-job training. And 87% require no prior experience. We are finding in this country where things are becoming available right in front of our eyes. So it may not be in every community.
Right. Well, so what you're basically saying is that anybody who is on SNAP, who is not working, is what, lazy?
No, sir. You just heard the young chairman.
You just gave these statistics. I'm trying to understand the point you're trying to make.
What I'm trying to say is that the people who found jobs 87% have not required prior training. That there are jobs available, where jobs are available, and you show up and you do your best.
And that's what most people do, Mr. Chairman. And that's what most people do on the program.
All we're trying to say is that it's not like there's necessarily this huge skills gap. I think there's a skills gap for the next job. Ms. Torres, do you seek time? Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Conaway, you come before this committee with a bill that would have a terrible impact on my home state of California and in my community as a whole. And I have to tell you that it has been a tough year and a half already for the great state of California. Last December, Republican leadership passed a massive tax cut for corporations. Many California families did not see a cut or a benefit. They saw their taxes go up. Meanwhile, this administration is sending ICE into our communities, splitting up families and harassing business owners. People in my district are scared. Kids in my district are staying home. Moms are not seeking health care because they're afraid to go out. And now congressional Republicans want to take food away from hungry children and families. It is shameful. It is shameful that we would punish kids because their parents' inability to find a job that pays a living wage. Chairman Sessions, I have 2 letters that I would like to include for the record. One letter comes from the California State Association of Counties, the Welfare Directors Association of California, and the County Executive Association of California. They make a case that this bill would increase hunger and food insecurity nationwide. The second letter comes from the California Department of Food and Ag and the California Health and Human Services Agency. There are also objections to this bill, and I quote, it would impose new time limits and work requirements on more people in need of food, regardless of available jobs and training in the region, their individual skills, and barriers to their access to work supports like childcare, like public transportation if you can't afford to buy a car and pay for insurance for your car. I don't know about you, Mr. Chairman, but when I worked the graveyard shift at LAPD, I don't know when the last time that you tried to find childcare for your children when you're working the graveyard shift. There are not available people to do that. And when they are available, they charge a great deal of money. This is welfare for corporations. This is not assistance to the working poor in my community. Just ask Uber. Out of their 833,000 Uber drivers, it only makes up for about 133,000 full-time employees because they get so little hours. Maybe they choose to because they have 3 or 4 other jobs. San Bernardino County is once again the fastest growing county in this country. But you know what? Those jobs, the manufacturing jobs, are gone. And now, thanks to the Trump administration, with steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs, we're going to lose more jobs, thanks to this administration. But yet, we're not taking that into account in this bill, because we don't care about poor people. We only care about the top 1%, and that sickens me. Chairman Conway, I have been reaching out to service providers in my district, and I can tell you they are very concerned about how this bill is going to impact our community. They are concerned that they're going to have a lot of people back at their food bank, especially the working poor. One food bank in our area, the Community Action Partnership of San Bernardino County, shared a very powerful story, and I want you to hear it. They received a call just a few days ago from a former client a woman asking how she could donate food to the food bank. You see, for years, her family had relied on the food bank's program while her husband was out of work. But he had a job now, and they were back on their feet, and they wanted to know how they can repay the food bank and help other families. We can't rely on people like that to do the work of government. This Congress has not raised the minimum wage. Those are the issues that we need to be talking about. We need to raise the minimum wage. We need to build affordable housing. We need to provide childcare. We need to close the loop and fund healthcare programs for the working poor. That's what we need to be working for. We can't pass this bill on the backs of the working poor, and certainly not the working poor in California. I ask my colleagues to vote against this bill that would be a gift to the corporations and a punishment to families that are trying to make ends meet, and I yield back.
Joan yields back his time. Is there any other member of the committee that would seek time with the young chairman? Mr. Conaway, we want to thank you not only for your time with us today, but for your 163 hearings and the things that you have done to take this issue on to keep the farm community alive and to really study social and economic behavior around this country. I know that there are a number of people who are in that study also and have helped participate with you, but thank you for taking time to be here today.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Let me add 2 points. One, food bank funding under our bill goes up 4 times, so there'll be more food bank money for those. And the story my good colleague shared with us about that family who worked themselves out of these circumstances and began to define public assistance, and that's what they were doing for other people. That's the exact model we're trying to promote with my bill. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me tonight. Appreciate it. And I ask the committee to make a rule in order to bring my bill to the floor.
I wanted to also add into the record statement of administrative policy from the Executive Office of the President, OMB, the last statement: if H.R. 2 were presented to the President in its current form, his advisors would recommend that he sign the bill into law. That is because of the awesome and magnanimous work that was done by the gentleman from the chairman of the committee from Texas. I appreciate it very much, Michael. Have a great evening. Okay, as we are now going to move forth so that we can get this bill on the floor tomorrow. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas, the gentleman, Dr. Michael Burgess. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4698, the Protect and Serve Act of 2018, structured rule. This rule will provide 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill should be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only the further amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, which shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by a proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for the division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of S 2372, the Veterans Cemetery Benefit Correction Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of H.R. 5674 as reported by the Committee on Veterans Affairs, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2, the Agricultural Nutrition Act of 2018, under a structured rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member on the Committee on Agriculture. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order as original text for the purpose of an amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Agriculture, now printed in the bill, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in either Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report and may be offered only by the member designated in the report. It shall be considered as read. It shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for the division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. Finally, the rule provides that no further consideration of the bill shall be in order except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas. I'm going to yield myself 1 minute to explain. This is one rule, 3 bills, H.R. 5698, Protect and Serve, structured rule, 1 hour debate. Judiciary Committee makes an order 1 amendment. S. 2373, Vets Mission, a 1 hour debate, provides for adoption of H.R. 5674 as reported by the committee and modified by a manager's amendment, considered row number 1, motion to recommit allowed. H.R. 2, Farm Bill structured rule, 1 hour general debate. Agriculture makes in order 20 amendments. This will get those amendments started. Subsequently, we will soon find out when the gentleman from Florida asked me, but that we will be meeting tomorrow at 3 o'clock for an amendments that will be considered in addition to this for H.R. 2. Is there any amendment or discussion to this?
Yes.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I have an amendment to the rule. I
Sorry,
move the committee amend the rule to provide that on adoption of the rule, H.R. 2 is recommitted to the Committee on Agriculture with instructions to consider a farm bill that does not decrease access to SNAP benefits, will not lead to fewer people enrolled in SNAP, and will not cut SNAP benefits for enrollees. And if I could just say one thing, because I want to be crystal clear. The chairman said something here that I take strong exception to. He said, if you're working, we're going to have your back no matter what, and we're going to, or if you're in a job training program, don't worry about anything. But when you eliminate broad-based categorical eligibility, you eliminate state flexibility. And in states like mine in Massachusetts, where you can qualify for this program up to 200% of the poverty line, which is about $23,000. Under this bill, it's mandatorily reduced to 130% of the poverty line. So you could be working and earning $23,000 a year, and right now getting SNAP, and you will lose that benefit. So we don't have your back if you're working. And the bottom line is that, I will repeat what I said from the very beginning. This is not thought out. This is nobody. This is the biggest. This is why there is such dissension in the Agriculture Committee, because this did not reflect a process with any integrity. This language appeared out of nowhere. I don't know where it was written. Maybe the Speaker's office, maybe the Heritage Foundation, but this is not the product of a deliberative process in the Agriculture Committee. Nobody knows the answers to any of the questions that were asked in the Agriculture Committee, and even on the education and training program. Again, we have estimated that the benefit would be the cuts in SNAP benefits to fund this education and training program, if everybody who is eligible took advantage of it, would add up to about $30 per person. I don't care how you want to, what you think about the need to expand education and training programs. This doesn't do it. It creates this underfunded bureaucracy that falls on states, and I can't believe the conservatives are going for this. This is a big unfunded mandate on states. This doesn't make any sense. And I think what really is happening is this, and that is, I think the attempt here is to make the program so difficult and so burdensome and so overwhelming that people who need this benefit don't even apply for it, can't jump through all the hoops. And that really is cynical. And so I think we should send this bill back to committee, and let's get the Agriculture Committee to go back to its traditions of being bipartisan and fair and open-minded, and let's come up with a bill that has bipartisan support as previous ag bills have. And I urge a yes vote on this.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Vote now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it.
Ask for
Noes
roll
have it.
call.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall, Mr. Burgess, Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins, Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck, no. Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern,
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk
no.
report total.
3 yeas, 6 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? See none. The vote now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas. Those in favor, Dr. Burgess' amendment, signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, ayes have it.
As for roll call.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall, Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins, Mr. Byrne, Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse, Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck, Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney, Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern,
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings,
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
6 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, will be handling this for Republicans.
I will handle it for the Democrats.
And the gentleman from Massachusetts will be handling it for Democrats. The gentleman from Florida normally asks a question at this time. It's previously been provided, but our next meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 3:00 p.m. for amendments consideration of H.R. 2. We appreciate the time that we've taken today. Thank you for the staff and the members and those accompanying people who've been here to watch this hearing today. Thank you very much. We will now be, we've now completed work for the day.